Welcome to Startup Growth Stories by ARC. Hear from founders of bootstrapped startups and decacorns. We discuss the successes and the failures and the things they learned along the way. In the final minutes, founders get vulnerable. They share how growing their business has impacted their lives. Join us every Thursday for a new startup growth story. And now, here's our host, Don Muir.
Good afternoon. I'm joined here with Godard Abel, CEO and co-founder of G2, the world's largest and most trusted software marketplace. More than 60 million people annually, including employees of the Fortune 500 companies, use G2 to make smarter software decisions based on authentic peer reviews. For those who don't know, Godard is a serial entrepreneur. He led multiple companies through exit, including BigMachines, which is acquired by Oracle, and SteelBrick, which is acquired by Salesforce. Thanks for coming on the podcast with me, Godard. Our team are huge fans of the G2 platform and the ecosystem you've built. I can't imagine a world in which you did not exist. Welcome.
Thank you for the kind welcome, Don.
Let's dive right in. So jumping into it in 3 words or fewer, who is Godard Abel?
Conscious entrepreneur.
And who's your biggest inspiration?
Marc Benioff.
Why is that?
I've built now, 5 companies somewhat in the greater Salesforce ecosystem. And Marc also acquired the second company we built, SteelBrick. So I spent a little bit over a year working at Salesforce in Johanna, as he calls it. And I've just admired his ability to build a company of such impact, and also his philanthropy, 111 model, and everything he does. And I think you're in San Francisco, but the UC Benioff Children's Hospitals and the Oceans Initiatives, all of that. Plus he's built, one of the biggest software companies in the world with a very positive culture. And so I aspire to have more impact like Marc has.
Amazing. I imagine you know him pretty well as well, personally.
Yeah, I've certainly studied him. I've met him a few times. I don't know him super well, but certainly admire his work. And whenever I have met him, I've found it to be fascinating and inspiring.
Well, thanks for sharing that. Normally at this point, we get right into the founding story. This is, after all, Startup Growth Stories, where we interview successful founders on the trials and tribulations of building their business. But before we get to G2, there's a lot more I just want to dive into, starting with your original dive into the world of entrepreneurship. So my understanding is your grandfather and father started a manufacturing business out of World War II. Is that right?
Yes. No, I've always admired my grandfather, Wilhelm, although he passed when I was 5 years old, but I still remember him. But also his story, he started his company in 1947. And this was, Germany was rubble. They were from the Northeast, a town called Essen. And because it was kind of this steel industrial heartland, it had just gotten bombed and flattened. And so I remember my father also, luckily my grandmother was sent to a farm out in the countryside, which he did with most women during the war. So he was born there. But I remember he said he only ate potatoes for the first 9 years of life. And but during that time, my grandfather also didn't have a job, but he'd been a very hands-on engineer in the merchant marine before World War II. He worked in the waterworks in Düsseldorf during the war, kind of keeping the water system running. So he was a very hands-on pump engineer, and he just had a vision for a better pump design to pump slurries out of the coal mines in the Ruhr Valley. And but he had no capital, and so he and his brother was a sales guy, he was the engineer, but they just kind of bootstrapped the company, came up with a better pump design for piston membrane pumps, patented, and then they would just go sell deals, and then they'd outsource all the manufacturing until after many years, they got enough scale to build their own manufacturing.
And how did that experience, if at all, it kind of influence your perspective on, how business and the world works?
Well, one, I think growing up with my father, I think he and I would actually talk about business a lot. And even when I was a kid, he'd take me in his office on weekends. A couple of summers I worked in his pump manufacturing plant. So it just, we were always talking business. So I think it inspired me. I think that's actually why I wanted to be an entrepreneur, build my own company. But it was also daunting. Because remember, to me, my father always seemed like a larger than life figure. And, now I'd call it a small company, about 100 people. But to me, it seemed giant. And I'm like, wow, I want to be like my dad, but I'm not sure I ever could. But it very much inspired and I think formed me. And I remember my father also had this expression. He's like, entrepreneurship's also always scary. He's like, hey, if I go to business, that's okay. He's like, I'm okay sleeping under a bridge in Paris. And so I also remember that. I think I probably also got the risk-seeking nature, and that if you fail, that's okay. And I think what he taught me and my sister was, as long as you have an education, you can take risk, because worst case, your business goes under, spend a night under the bridge in Paris and find a new job.
You have to unpack this bridge in Paris reference for us.
Yeah, and I think my father also loved France, and my grandmother was from Alsace-Lothringen, from Metz, so also grew up, speaking a lot of French. But I think that was kind of his thing. If I've got no money, I'll just go sleep under a bridge in Paris, in a place I love, but I'll still be okay. I think was his point. Like I'll be okay even if my business fails.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. And so your first entrepreneurial endeavor was coming out of Stanford when you launched BigMachines. I think you were capitalized by the former president of Heinz and former CEO of Apple. Is that right?
Yes. No, and I think longtime students of Silicon Valley might remember John Sculley. He was actually originally the CEO of Pepsi, like a rising star. This was way back in the 80s. And when Steve Jobs, the founder, CEO of Apple, was on his first tour of duty at Apple, and they'd gone to public company, he kind of felt like Steve Jobs was in his 20s. So he and his board felt like they needed a more senior CEO to lead Apple as a mass public company. So he had that famous story. We went and recruit John Sculley. And he used a line because, as I mentioned, John was CEO of Pepsi, but he's like, hey, do you want to be selling colored sugar water the rest of your life? Or do you want to change the world? And I guess Jobs was an amazing recruiter. So John joined him. But then I think the story kind of turned, kind of bittersweet, where then John Sculley and the board a couple of years later actually removed Steve Jobs from the company. And which, a decade later led to his great comeback. But John was a very famous person in the Valley. And I think also in the 80s, at some point, he was named like CEO of the year. And so I was lucky to have him as an angel investor because he was viewed as a tech visionary and having his name, that was a .com era when I was graduating from Stanford, everyone was starting internet companies. But once I had John Sculley, I could very quickly raise, 6 million seed funding just based on PowerPoint and a few smart kids.
Yeah, makes sense. And how did you actually get in touch with him for the first time? And how did you convince him to cut you that first check?
Yeah, and it was a connection back to my father because his brother, David Sculley, was the president of Heinz Ketchup. And my father had moved my family to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I mentioned it was a German pump manufacturer, but my father wanted to start a U.S. subsidiary. And he was struggling to do it from Germany. So he decided to move the family because he thought the U.S. could be a huge market for his pumps. And I remember he picked Pittsburgh, wanted that German community. And his rationale was within a 500-mile radius of 2/3 of the U.S. population at that time, not too far from New York and Chicago. So we wound up in Pittsburgh. But then my father was a golfer, and his golf club, one of the members was David Sculley, who happened to be the president of Heinz Ketchup, but also the brother of John. And I remember I first had this idea for BigMachines, Thanksgiving '99. And I was living in what was called the reality distortion zone at the time, the Silicon Valley, where the internet was going to change everything overnight. And there were billions being poured into it. And then I went back to Pittsburgh, and it was kind of sobering. I talked to my dad about the internet, and I said, Dad, how's it going to affect your pump business? And he was just like, well, it's not. And I said, what do you mean, Dad? Like everyone's going to get Amazon. And Amazon had already launched, and people already had that fear. I think 20 some years later, people are still afraid to get Amazon. But at the time, Amazon was only selling books and CDs, and people probably don't remember what CDs were. But they're only in two categories. They're very simple products, just SKUs you could easily sell. And my dad explained to me, no, my pumps are very configured for every customer application based on pressure, flow rate, viscosity, fluid content. We configure different pump, different motors, couplings, housings, materials, and there's no way you could sell that kind of a product online. You need a German pump engineer. But I was inspired. I saw what Dell was doing, and Michael Dell, another great entrepreneur of the 90s. And obviously Dell is still a huge company today, but he was one of the first to sell PCs online with a configurator. And back then PCs were more configurable. You pick your Dell Latitude. I want the 15-inch screen. I want this memory, this hard drive, this operating system. Behind the scene, there was a rules engine. Make sure all those choices, those components fit together. You could see price and delivery change in real time. And so what inspired me then is like, I want to help my dad sell pumps like Michael Dell sells PCs.
And so was he right? I mean, was your dad right about the pump business being insulated from, the pressures from Amazon, or kind of what ultimately happened there?
Yeah, and sadly, I think he was more right than wrong, because I think what I underestimated, and I think in 30 years, 40 years, I was right, but certainly in 3 or 4 years, he was right. And because what happened then, by 2001, it was like the .com boom went to the .bomb bust. And it was also a very hard time, I remember, in San Francisco. I started my company, BigMachines, in the Bay Area. And I remember in 2001, there was never any traffic from San Francisco to Palo Alto. Like never. Everyone was leaving the area. You could Priceline, a hotel room. Remember the Hyatt SF for $29 a night. And so the area was really suffering because all these .coms were going bust. And so BigMachines, we also had a really hard time because we're calling on these manufacturers, pump manufacturers. In the first year, they were still like, oh, internet hype, I should learn. By the second year, they're like, well, no, the internet was a fad. We like sending our customers CD-ROMs to configure our pumps, paper catalogs, and the internet was a fad. And thank you for visiting us, but there's no way we're buying your software because you're probably also going bankrupt next year. So it's turned into a really tough struggle because we were way ahead of product market fit.
So, spoiler alert for the listeners on the podcast, you ultimately led that business to tens of millions in revenue and sold to Oracle, but it sounds like along the way, there were some road bumps. And it sounds like the market environment then wasn't too dissimilar from some of the turmoil we're experiencing in the tech markets today. For the benefit of the founders who are listening in, what are some of the key learnings you can share on overcoming those obstacles or during that time with this first endeavor?
And I think the probably biggest lesson learned was just perseverance. And I think for an entrepreneur, I think, really having, I would say you need to commit to a peak, but some vision how your companies are going to change the world that you're really committed to and really willing to suffer for. Because I think more entrepreneurial journeys have long periods of struggle, before breakout success. Like I've been involved in starting 5 SaaS businesses. None of them have been like, at least what I read about Facebook, where Mark Zuckerberg, spent one all-nighter and all of Harvard was using Facebook. And, within a year, every university was using it. And,
I thought that's how it worked too. So
yeah, I've never had that experience. Like I haven't been smart or lucky enough as an entrepreneur. So I think usually there's a period of struggle. And for us, it was frankly the first 3 or 4 years where we were able to sell very few deals. But I think, and we had to cut down the team. First year, we were able to raise money just on hype and .com. But then we had to cut from 70 down to 20 people just to survive. And then we also at some point realized like 2002, 2003, we weren't going to be able to raise any more money. Also, venture capital was pulling way back and our metrics were terrible. And so we had to go into organic growth mode. And but then by 2007 is when it started to take off. So we did persevere. And ultimately where we turned the corner, and I also mentioned Marc Benioff earlier, where we partnered with Salesforce, we partnered with Siebel, Oracle On Demand, and all of a sudden the cloud and cloud CRM started taking off, and we found a different application for BigMachines, which was sales configuration, sales quoting. And as Salesforce moved up market to big companies like GE, they needed a partner like BigMachines that could handle complex quoting, complex configurations, integrated into a CRM solution. So very different than our original vision of selling pumps online, but related because both of them required this configuration engine and pricing engine. And so, eventually we did find that product market fit. But I think my main thing is, I think most entrepreneurial journeys, it's probably going to take longer than you think. And so I think having that emotional commitment, and obviously I think staying leaner if you could, that was one mistake I made. Like I wish I hadn't hired up to 70 people. Like I wish I just stayed at 20 until I found product market fit. And so I think also, I think the longer you can stay lean and really make sure the product, you do have the initial product market fit, it does work for those initial customers and you're really seeing the demand before you scale up. But it's also easy to say in hindsight. Also I think if I hadn't made those mistakes, I would have never learned. But those were some of the lessons we learned.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, hindsight's always 2020. There's a lot to unpack there, but one of the most transferable takeaways is you raise a lot of money during the peak of the market, like we experienced in 2020, 2021. You hire a big team, and then you realize after the fact, when the market corrects, you need to lean out a little bit. I think a lot of the founders who are listening to the call today can relate to that. And so, obviously, a really challenging position to be in. Do you have any other? So perseverance, incredibly important. What other advice would you have for founders who are potentially short on funding or realize that their OpEx might be a little bit bloated, they're not yet positive free cash flow, and they're having a hard time making the numbers foot in terms of runway? Is there anything that you would have potentially done different in hindsight, or maybe any advice for these founders who are going through something very similar in today's market in 2022?
And I would say at BigMachines, I wish I'd done it sooner, because I did it, like I went from 70 to 20 in like 2 or 3 steps. And it was painful. It's always painful because a lot of the employees, my friends, and they were good employees. Like it wasn't their fault. I just invested too early. So it's painful, but I'd say adapt, get efficient even quicker, if you can. And I do think this economic cycle is probably going to last at least a few quarters. So I do think getting efficient faster is one thing. And then probably the other thing I really learned, I'm actually talking about the G2, because G2, just to bring you up to speed, somewhat similar. Last year, we raised $157 million. So in total, now we've raised $257 million, and we were able to do great growth around last year, became a unicorn. And obviously also with that, put in a plan to grow even ARR even faster. And frankly, the reality for us also this year, we're not able to achieve that. We're not able to achieve our accelerated growth plan. And so we are also working to get more efficient. And so far, we've been able to do that by just essentially, pausing hiring. Still some critical roles, but net keeping headcount, keeping spend flat, and not increasing our team like we'd planned at the beginning of the year. But then the other one I like to talk about is Flucht nach vorn, and it's a German expression, flee to the front, kind of old Prussian military term. But the idea, when the bombs are dropping, when there's chaos, one of the best things to do is flee to the front. And I think the way you do that in business, and what I'm doing now, is go out and see as many customers as possible. And that's also the other thing I learned at BigMachines. Like, I became the head of sales because I said, hey, at the end of the day, if we can't sell, it was literal. It was very, like, it went beyond Stanford Business School strategy theory. It's just like, I can't raise money. So if I don't sell, 100,000 in deals this month, we're going bankrupt. So I better sell 100,000 in deals this month. And so I really learned to focus on customers and sales. And I think that's something I'm doing again in G2, trying to set the example. Like last week, I went to Dreamforce conference in SF, and we have 3,000 software vendor customers. Many of them were there, met as many of them as possible. Salesforce, important customer partner, met them. The week before that, I was at SaaStr. The week before that, I was at HubSpot Inbound. This week, I'm going to Silicon Slopes. I'm going to Dublin, SaaStock, India, visit our team there, doing the G2 Live event. So I think also really being the evangelist and not losing that positive spirit and going out, meeting the customers, the prospect, evangelizing. Because I think that's our job as founders, right? If we're not passionate, and it's hard, right? Because on the one hand, you are depressed, like you're not able to grow as fast as you want. Maybe you have to make some hard changes in your company. So that's hard. So you feel sad, and that's natural. And you want to feel that, but then still have the positive energy to go out there, sell the next deal, evangelize. I think that's critical. And so I think it's that combination. And it's hard, right? It's emotionally hard to both be able to get efficient faster and at the same time go sell, market with more energy and passion than ever. But I do think that's what you have to do to succeed in a tough time.
Absolutely. And very well said. In fact, one of the segments we like to cover on this podcast with all the founders we bring on is his point around being vulnerable in order to actually help other founders who are listening in cope with some of the challenges with founding, scaling, and operating a business, particularly in trying times. And so just on that, as a segue, I mean, how do you maintain that level of optimism and kind of go forward with a positive attitude and look glass half full for your team? Like, do you have any tips or advice on how to maintain that level of positivity?
Yeah, I think what naturally does it for me is just going into meetings with customers and going to industry events. Cause I just find, because when you're talking to a customer, and this might be the same for you, Don, like it's just your belief, your energy comes out, about how you can help them. So I do think getting out there, getting out in the market, like I think naturally I get energy from that, just feeling and seeing customers, prospects, partners is, I think helps me derive energy. And then probably the other big thing I've learned is just taking care of myself. And I wasn't so good at my first company. Honestly, like for a while, I was like eating too much, drinking too much to deal with all the stress and anxiety. And I remember during BigMachines during that time, also my wife and I, we had twins. They were born premature. This was like in 2004. And my life honestly just felt overwhelming. And like I said, I didn't necessarily deal with it well. I think the good thing I kept doing, like I would at least go for like a run every day. Like I found for me, like having a physical outlet. And, but then I eventually also met a conscious leadership coach, Jim Dethmer, who started a whole movement around conscious leadership. And I just learned so much from him, found him very inspiring. And also I started working on meditation, breathing, becoming more self-aware. I've worked with a coach ever since, a personal / leadership coach. And I do think over the years, my self-awareness has grown. I'm more willing to accept the negative and the positive emotions. And entrepreneurship is the ultimate roller coaster. The highs, the lows. I'm sure you're feeling it. And so it takes a lot of emotional fortitude. I think even more, and I think the intellect and most entrepreneurs are smart, but at the end of the day, I think it's more the emotional fortitude that makes a difference, right? And having that ability to persevere, to energize your teams, your customers. But it can also be very rewarding. But I do think there can be a lot of, like for me, a lot of overwhelming anxiety and fear of failure. And that's all real. And learning how to deal with that, I think, it's been important for me to, be better at the journey, but, hopefully also make it more enjoyable.
So just to distill that down for our listeners, physical exercise is important, bringing on a coach to focus on conscious leadership. Would you mind just defining what that is?
Yeah, and I would say it's like self-aware leadership. And I do think it starts with breathing, presencing, and because I think once you're self-aware, and they talk about being above the line when you're like open to connection, open to creativity with your teams, or being below the line. And for me, that shows up as like being angry, righteous, like just freaking do this, right? And I told you, and you can get that way with your team, and you can get mad at your customers, like why won't they just buy, and why are they being so difficult? And when you're in a below line state, like I find I'm not very receptive to new ideas. I'm not very creative. And the idea is by breathing, becoming self-aware, feeling your physical emotions strains, you can shift back to being above the line and being open and creative and being the kind of leader I think we all want to be. So that's the journey I've been on, and I would recommend any entrepreneur. And there's a website, conscious.is. You can check it out. They have a great book on conscious leadership, great online thought leadership. But also, I think if you can get a coach, in a lot of ways, a coach to me is also more like a therapist, and just help you better deal with your own emotion, because I think it'll make your journey more enjoyable, and I think you'll be more successful at it. So I wish I'd started doing that work earlier.
And when do you think the right point is to bring someone on as a founder or CEO of a startup? Is there a particular inflection point in the business where that becomes most relevant? Is it relevant for pre-seed founders listening in, Series C? Like, can you pinpoint when the right time in your career was to have a coach actually help you develop this muscle around self-awareness and conscious leadership?
And I mean, I'd say the sooner the better. The reality is a lot of these coaches are also expensive, But I also think a lot of board members, investors are also getting smarter about this. Like, hey, investing in the health of their CEO and leadership team is worthwhile. But I would say, the sooner you can do it, the better. And I didn't do it until I think, this BigMachines was having some success. We were probably up to like 20 million revenue, maybe 100 people or so. But I wish I'd done it sooner. And what I also did at that point, I joined YPO, which I also found to be an amazing experience, Young Presidents Organization. Many of you. There's also have a sister organization called EO, Entrepreneurship's Organization. And partly what YPO, EO have, they have peer forums where you meet with peer entrepreneurs, peer CEOs. And YPO, starts obviously for younger ones, EO, same thing. And I do think if you can get a peer forum like that, which a lot of ways becomes like peer therapy. And I do think being an entrepreneur is a unique, lonely experience. I make the analogy. It's a lot like being a parent until you've been one. You can't relate. You know what I mean? And so I also find a natural bond to other entrepreneurs like you, Don, because we just have a common, unique experience. And if you can be in a forum through YPO, EO, there's other organizations that do this and get that peer support, peer mentorship. For me, it's been invaluable.
Yeah, definitely. That makes a ton of sense. And that's something that we're trying to build, that sense of community. That's something we're trying to build here at ARC, and candidly why we launched Startup Growth Stories, to talk to more experienced startup founders and CEOs who have been through the pain and the roller coaster ride of building and scaling an enterprise. And so that's ultimately why we're on this podcast with you today. So really appreciate you sharing this with us. Maybe double clicking on your time now at G2. Obviously, have had a lot of success. It sounds like you're dealing with the macro like everyone else is. You've touched on a few different elements as we kind of read up on your background and listened to some of your other podcasts around trust and authenticity in sales, team and culture, management framework. I wanted to double click on a couple of those items, specifically on the first point here. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of building your company rooted around the theme of trust and what trust means to you?
Yeah, no, I do think trust is absolutely essential, and also what G2 is all about, because we want to help software buyers make trusted decisions, right? Gain trust through peer reviews on the right apps to buy. But I also say for your own company culture. And I was also we were very inspired when we started G2 as a second company, and we were probably lucky, we had some success. We, first sold a majority of BigMachines to growth equity firms, and then it sold to Oracle. So we were in a bit of a luxurious position of when we were starting our second company, we were able to do the initial funding ourselves and felt a little bit less desperate. And so we had time to be more thoughtful about the culture we want to build. And frankly, the first 5 team members, my co-founders, we'd all work together at BigMachines, and we're like, hey, why do this? And so we thought a lot about culture. And at that time, I met entrepreneur Chip Conley, also another Stanford alum. And he'd written a whole book called Peak, and how you build, really trusted, but also really inspiring cultures. And he'd built a hotel chain in San Francisco called Joie de Vivre, a really cool boutique hotels. And then he went on to become the head of hospitality for Airbnb. So Chip's a great entrepreneur in his own right, but he was very thoughtful about culture, and he applied Maslow's hierarchy of need to cultures and came up with this P culture. And he said that, especially he said really it's all heart-centered cultures where, the center of a great culture is heart and authentic caring and feeling, where your employees really feel like you care about them, your customers really feel that, your investors feel it. And that ultimately you can end up with a culture where your employees are inspired, they find meaning in their work, and it gives them a why, it gives them a purpose. And that's really what we set out to do at G2.
Yeah, that's really great. And it kind of ties back to your earlier point around management style, staying above the line as opposed to below the line, and motivating your team. You actually made a really interesting point, and I didn't want to escape past. You talked around funding source and how that can impact motivations of the founding team and how you're setting up the business. Can you just unpack that a little bit? Can you talk about how source of capital and fundraising, obviously you raised a lot of capital from a variety of stakeholders and during across your three businesses, or 3+ businesses, it sounds like. How does source of capital impact your motivations, your incentives, how you're actually structuring the business? And for those listening today, how should they think about venture financing versus bootstrapping versus other forms of financing, and how that's going to set them up for success, and maybe for work-life balance and for stress and for kind of other factors that are driving the business today?
Yeah, and I do think the nice thing about bootstrapping, or in our case, we were able to self-finance for a while, is you can be more thoughtful, about culture and really the product, and have more time to find that product market fit.
Why is that?
Well, I think once you take on investors, rightfully so, there's healthy pressure to deliver returns for them. And most investors, for their fund to be successful, they want returns, 3, 5, 7 years. And so, kind of a clock starts. And so you do have pressure to grow faster. And, and I think it can be wonderful. Like, we've had great investors, but you have to be ready for it. And if you do it too soon, which in hindsight I did at BigMachines, right? We overinvested, and then frankly, it leads to more pain, more dilution for the founders. So and frankly, vehicles like yours also weren't available 20 years ago. But I do think, there are other options now, right? And I do think if you can bootstrap for a while, or even like people are talking about Figma now, has such an incredible success, 20 billion, but reality is I think they didn't really raise venture for like 4 years, and sweated for a long time just on getting the product right. So I do think if you can bootstrap and obviously, and sometimes you just need the money. That's also reality as an entrepreneur, right? We're all pragmatic, but if you can, generate enough revenue, bootstrap for a while, keep full control, I think you have more ability to shape the culture, find true product market fit, and decide, hey, do you really, when you take that venture fuel, which can be great, because if you look at most of the tech giants, Amazon, Google, they did all take the venture drug at some point. It's a steroid, right? And if used properly, it's great. But a lot of times, you have that steroid, you have all that muscle, and the bones aren't ready for it, right? You break. So it's
That's quite the analogy
to be conscious of.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I like to draw analogy to to jet fuel, and it's expensive, and when you put it in and you ignite, and you can burn a ton of it really quickly and grow really quickly. But if the infrastructure is not there, it could be, it might not be the right time for your business, or the right source of capital.
Also makes me think of Elon and SpaceX, and Elon, another entrepreneur I admire, and but his first 3-4 rockets did blow up. Right, in that case, very literally, and he almost went bankrupt. And I think, frankly, SpaceX and Tesla would have never been created if he wasn't able to self-fund it. And that is one nice thing, and hopefully all the entrepreneurs get there. Like, the second and third company is a lot easier, I will say, if you have one exit.
Is that purely because you can self-finance, or are there other, major learnings from your first endeavor that are just a no-brainer your second time around, thinking, I'm not going to make that mistake again?
I'd say both. I think one, you do have the ability to self-finance, and I highly recommend it. Get your product to product market fit, shape the culture first before you take that money, if you can do that. But secondly, yes, certainly lessons learned. And third, I would say the biggest advantage is people just believe you more. And it's also somewhat perplexing. Because your first company, everyone's like, I don't know, if you can do it. Once you have one successful exit, all of a sudden it's much easier to recruit, find customers, find investors, because you have this aura of success. And I think particularly in the Valley, like they say, people, you kind of accept failure, but people kind of worship success. So once you've had one win, it's a lot easier to do the second, third, fourth, fifth, and obviously most people stop at some point. I'm still going, but to me, it's gotten more fun and easier, every time. And you're also just more aware of the dynamics and all these lessons learned the first time. It's also more fun the first time in a way, but the first time for me was just like adrenaline and survival and, learning on the fly, but I didn't really know what I was doing in hindsight.
Yeah, I can relate to that. So your first endeavor going into the second, you brought it sounds like you brought your co-founders along for the ride.
Yep.
They came the second time around. Are any of these individuals still with you today? What inspired your decision to work with the same founding team the second time around? And how did kind of those, if you don't mind sharing, how did those relationships evolve?
Yeah, and it was actually kind of different founders, but we're all still working together. So my BigMachines co-founder, Chris Schutz, he actually wound up staying at Oracle after the acquisition. And he and I are now building another company called Logic.io. Well, he's really building it. He's a CEO, but I'm on his board, chairman, helped him fund it. So he's building another one now. And that's probably become the theme in our entrepreneurial family. We keep building new companies. And now I'm also in a position where I can help fund them, advise them. But because of the four co-founders at G2 was like my head of sales, Matt, and he was like, most brilliant sales leader I had. He was doing that BigMachines. Our head of product from BigMachines, Tim, and our head of design, Mark, and a young engineer, Mike Wheeler, young brilliant engineer, became our CTO. So kind of took the best people for the job to build the next company from the team at BigMachines. And Tim Handorf, my co-founder, he's still with me building G2. He's now head G2 Labs, kind of our innovation lab, and doing a great job with that. Mike Wheeler, the CTO, he's also with Tim and Wheels. So they're kind of doing the new innovations and new products at G2. And then Matt Gorniak, my co-founder, he's now the CEO of another startup, 3Kit, where I'm the chairman investor. So he became the CEO of his own startup. And Mark Myers is the co-founder of another startup, Carrier Source, where I'm also an investor and advisor. And because we have found, some people, a lot of founding types, like once you get up to 700 employees and you need like process and a lot of like quote unquote boring big company stuff from the perspective of an entrepreneur, like I think some then prefer to go do their own thing. And frankly, I also love that now. And I probably see that being part of my next chapter, helping our quote unquote entrepreneurial family, our alumni, like build their own businesses.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like you've built quite the network of founders across your entrepreneurial journey, and that's got to be really rewarding to be able to ultimately give back to folks who have been major contributors throughout your career.
Yeah, no, it feels I'd say fun and natural.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you talk a little bit about that scale up? So we discussed, kind of setting the rails and getting started. I'd like to understand, you mentioned scaling up to hundreds of employees, and now you're at the point where you're pausing hiring for the time being as you monitor the macro. But getting to that point, just talk about what are some of the fundamental changes, maybe as a founder, as an operator, how you're viewing the business differently from this initial tribe, this initial family on your founding team to scaling up to hundreds of employees. What are some of the major changes for you as the founder of the business that are most notable?
I do think Reid Hoffman, the LinkedIn founder in Blitzscaling, he creates a really nice model, where how a company changes. And at the beginning, it's more like a family or a tribe, probably 1 to 50 people. And that's actually, I think, a fun time to be the founder CEO because you basically know every person on the team. And frankly, you can almost make every significant decision yourself. You're involved in everything. And those first 50 employees, you also, at some point, you hire managers, but they're only managing one team each. You'll have one head of sales, one head of marketing, one head of product engineering, but it's still, frankly, pretty easy to manage and everything. And for a lot of founder entrepreneurs, that may be the most fun part. And I think what gets hard, right, what I've been still learning, how do you let go and make less and less of the decisions? And then it becomes all about building a leadership team. And I just went through that the last couple of years at G2, where I brought in all new leaders, like our CRO, Mike Weir. He came from LinkedIn, and he was leading the enterprise marketing solutions, running a multi-$100 million business already. Our chief product officer, Sarah Rossio, she came from Power Reviews, but she'd built large-scale product teams. I brought a new CMO, Amanda Malco. She'd also, been at that next scale. She joined us from SurveyMonkey, or not SurveyMonkey, sorry, the other monkey, MailChimp. So, we just brought in like leaders that had been leading scale teams. And that's also hard, but also as a founder entrepreneur, what I found really helpful there was the No Rules Rules book by the Netflix founder, Reed. And he talks about this idea of having informed captains for decisions. And really, that's kind of hard for you as a founder or CEO. It means you let go a lot of decisions and rather just determine like who's the informed captain. And you make less and less decisions yourself. And you give more and more power to your leaders to run the business more and more. And what's hard and frustrating as a founder, sometimes we think we know how to do everything best, and maybe we do, right? And like at the beginning, you're determining the font on the website, the color on the logo, the pricing in each package, the discount on every deal. And actually, you're really good at it because your brain has all the context. You're probably better at all of those decisions than anyone else. But obviously, at some point, you just can't make them anymore, and you break, it breaks. And so that's what's been hard. And that's where the coaching, the conscious leadership is helpful, and just totally changing your style. And really where it just becomes about, you putting the right leaders in place, aligning them, and still being the evangelist, a spirit leader, but making less and less of the, actual decisions yourself.
And how do you know when the time is right to cede control, to delegate out that responsibility to your team, to bring on that seasoned operator? When do you start feeling kind of that you have too much on your plate and you need to create the more scalable, delegated approach?
And I think, around 50 employees, I think is when you probably need your first more senior leader that, is good at managing multiple teams, being a leader, a manager of managers, which is even a whole nother game than just managing one team. Somebody that can really help you lead the company. And then certainly, I think that certainly once you get to hundreds of employees, then it becomes absolutely essential. Your direct reports are all like kind of leaders first and doers second. Because the other thing at startups at the beginning, you hire generalists, right? Super motivated. You want all doers. And then at some point, your leaders have to be leaders, not doers. And but certainly by the time you get to 500 employees, that's probably where it broke for G2 is around 300-400. Like, we hadn't been really conscious about scaling leadership, and things alignment just started breaking. And so that's, I think, typical. And like I said, I think in Reed's book, he talks about, from like tribe to village to city to nation state. And just like government, it has to scale.
Thanks for sharing all of the insights across, your full career, from your first endeavor out of Stanford through present day. A lot of incredible learnings for our listeners who are on their first or second startup to learn from someone like you. I think just maybe reflecting back across the full entrepreneurial journey, if you could share with us, in your mind, what makes someone a successful entrepreneur? What sets them up for outperformance in the market?
I do think it's, passion and perseverance. And I think that emotional fortitude. And I think I've heard somebody say this. I think entrepreneurship, the successful ones, it's, yes, in the brain, but I think it's more in the gut and the heart. And so I think really having that emotional strength and fortitude so you can persevere and you can keep bringing that passion even in tough times. And I do think it starts with having a vision you really believe in. And I mentioned Elon earlier, right? But I think he really wants to make man a multiplanetary species. And he almost went bankrupt. And I don't know if you all know that part of his story, but 2008, that was the last big financial crisis. All the mortgage industry, finance crisis, everything was blowing up. And Tesla was almost bankrupt. SpaceX was almost bankrupt. Elon was bankrupt. He was sleeping on his friends' couches, but he persevered because he had so much passion and belief in the mission of his businesses. And I do think that's what's important when we're starting a company, that we really believe in it. And, we're going to do whatever it takes to ultimately make it succeed. And we find a way. And I think the great entrepreneurs do that. And they manage to keep the positive emotion. They manage to keep their passion and keep inspiring their teams and employees, even in tough times. And I do think this environment right now, Don, is challenging for all of us entrepreneurs. But also I think a great time for us all to, kind of prove our mettle and lead our teams through this, to that success. Because what I've also always seen, these downturns always end, the sun always returns, but you got to persevere and you got to be there, and you can be there and be stronger. And then you can really come out of it even better.
Inspiring. I'm reading Power Play by Tim Higgins. I don't know if you've read this book, but reading about Elon's story, I think you hit the nail on the head around perseverance. And now hearing it from you and your entrepreneurial journey is inspiring. And I really appreciate you taking the time to join Startup Growth Stories today and share that story back with our listeners. So thanks very much for your time and looking forward to sharing your story with the world.
Thank you, Don.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of Startup Growth Stories. To continue the discussion, head over to arc.tech.